Welcome to a deep dive into the wonderful world of watercolor. We're going to be tackling those common blunders that can sometimes, well, trip us up. You know, those ones that turn masterpieces into, shall we say, happy accidents. You shared a fantastic guide from Irish Art Mart, and I have a feeling it's about to become our new best friend, ready to banish those watercolor woes.
Absolutely. Let's get those brushes wet.
So, listener, you're here because you want to, really level up your watercolor game, right? You probably already got the basics down, but I bet even seasoned artists are going to find some really great tips here.
I think one of the most fascinating things about this guide is how it really starts with the foundation. Those very building blocks of watercolor painting, your material.
It highlights how crucial using the right paper, brushes, and paints can be.
Absolutely. It's like, well, imagine trying to bake a souffle with all the wrong ingredients.
You're kind of setting yourself up for a disaster, aren't you?
Exactly. And speaking of foundations, they really stress using high-quality watercolor paper. They recommend 100% cotton or cold-pressed paper because these can handle water much better without that, annoying buckling.
Makes sense. You don't want a soggy mess before you've even started. But even with the best paper, too much water is a recipe for, well,
Watery washes.
exactly. Makes me feel a bit better knowing that the guide calls it a common beginner mistake. But hey, we've all been there, right? Do you remember those early days?
Oh, absolutely. I think my first few paintings look like something out of a faded dream. The key takeaway here is control, that elusive balance of water and pigment. The guide suggests using a damp brush rather than one that's dripping wet. Imagine your brush is like a thirsty sponge. You just want it to soak up the right amount of water.
That's a great visual. Speaking of things that can make a painting look a little muddy, let's talk about color mixing. Sometimes I feel like no matter how carefully I mix, I always end up with this, I don't know, ambiguous brownish gray thing.
Oh, I know that color well. The guide actually recommends limiting your color mixing. It suggests sticking to a harmonious palette instead. Think of it this way. You wouldn't try to make every single color in a rainbow with just 3 primary colors, right?
Right.
You'd be missing out on so much nuance. It's the same with watercolor.
So instead of creating mud on our palettes, we should focus on layering washes to build up depth and let those individual colors sing.
Speaking of getting carried away, the guide also talks about overworking the paint. It's so tempting to keep fiddling with it, but I've learned the hard way that it rarely ends well. Watercolor requires a certain level of, I think, letting go. The guide really emphasizes working in sections and allowing each layer to dry completely before moving on. It's all about embracing the element of surprise, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And while we're on the topic of things that require a delicate touch, let's talk about those pesky blooms. You know, those little cauliflower-shaped spots that can pop up in your washes, seemingly out of nowhere.
They can be frustrating, but the guide explains that blooms happen when you apply wet paint over an area that's still damp. Timing is everything. However, if you want more control over your washes, they recommend trying the dry brush technique. It's all about having the right tool for the job, right?
And speaking of tools and techniques, the guide points out another common mistake: not using the right brushstrokes. I have to admit, there's a definite learning curve when it comes to those watercolor brushes.
They can be a bit like wild horses at first, full of potential but a little unpredictable. The guide encourages practicing basic brush strokes, like washes, dry brushing, and wet-on-wet techniques.
And those trusty scraps of watercolor paper are our best friends here. It's like a warm-up for the main event.
Speaking of warming up, this next mistake really reminds me of how crucial it is to have a game plan. The guide points out that a lot of beginners just dive right into a painting without a clear plan or composition in mind.
Oh, I'm so guilty of that. Sometimes I get so excited to start painting that I forget to actually think things through. But I'm starting to realize that a little planning goes a long way.
Absolutely. The guide suggests starting with even just like a light sketch. It's like creating a roadmap for your painting. It doesn't have to be a masterpiece or anything. It's more like a friendly guide to keep you on track.
And to help us stay on that path to watercolor success, the guide also warns against skipping essential tools.
Right, like masking fluid. Have you ever used that?
Oh, it's a total game changer. It's like magic for watercolors, especially when you're doing really intricate details or you're trying to preserve those really bright whites.
It's like having a little art assistant who helps you, keep those happy accidents in check. And speaking of happy accidents, the guide also reminds us about the importance of composition. It's not just about what you paint, but how you arrange those elements within your painting.
It's like interior design, but for paper, right? You could have the most beautiful furniture in the world, But if it's all arranged haphazardly, the room just won't feel right.
Exactly. The guide recommends familiarizing yourself with, basic compositional principles, things like the rule of thirds, balance, and focal points. It's all about creating that visual journey for the viewer's eye.
And let's not forget about the power of color. Or, well, more specifically, really understanding color theory. That's one of those things that can totally make or break a painting.
I couldn't agree more. The guide actually encourages us to really delve into that fascinating world of color theory. The color wheel, complementary colors, color harmony. It's like unlocking a secret code to create really stunning and harmonious paintings.
I've definitely been guilty of just kind of like winging it with colors in the past. And sometimes it works, but often not so much.
We've all been there. But what I love about the guide is that it really encourages experimentation. It's all about finding what works for you and developing your own, unique style.
And speaking of developing good habits, the guide also reminds us about the importance of taking care of our tools, specifically our brushes.
Yes. A clean brush is a happy brush, and a happy brush makes for a happy artist. They really emphasize the importance of rinsing your brushes, immediately after you use them.
I'll admit, I've been guilty of letting my brushes turn into abstract sculptures over the years because I don't know, I didn't clean them properly.
We've all been there. But think of it this way. You wouldn't want to use a dirty paintbrush on your face, right? So your watercolor brushes, they deserve that same level of care. The guide suggests using a gentle brush soap every now and then to remove any stubborn paint buildup and keep those bristles nice and in tip-top shape. Now, beyond these kind of specific tips, the guide also offers some fantastic, general advice for watercolor beginners and even, a few good reminders for us seasoned folks, too.
I'm all ears. What words of wisdom does the guide impart?
Well, they start by reminding us that patience is key. Watercolor takes time and practice. It's a dance. It's not a sprint. It's so true. It's a marathon, not a sprint. What else do they suggest? It's so easy to get caught up in wanting to see those results right away. But I think the real magic happens when you embrace the journey.
Exactly. Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither are watercolor skills. The guide also recommends keeping a watercolor journal.
Oh, I love that idea. It's like a visual diary for your art journey.
Precisely. It's a dedicated space where you can just experiment freely. You can test out new techniques and track your progress. You can even create little swatches of color combinations that you love.
And speaking of connecting with your creative side, the guide also talks about the importance of finding a supportive art community.
There's something so incredibly inspiring about connecting with other artists, sharing experiences, learning from each other, maybe even having a laugh over those happy accidents along the way.
It's like having your own little team of cheerleaders, the ones who really understand the unique joys and challenges of watercolor painting. I love that analogy. That's so true. And as we've kind of gone through this guide together, I keep coming back to that idea how those, what we call mistakes, those are often just opportunities in disguise, right? They can lead us to those unexpected discoveries, new techniques, a deeper understanding of this beautiful medium.
It's like the guide is giving us permission to embrace the unexpected and find the beauty and the imperfections.
Exactly. It's about letting go of the need for perfection and just, embracing the joy of the creative process.
I couldn't have said it better myself. So, listener, we've walked you through those common watercolor pitfalls, thanks to those brilliant minds at Irish Art Mart. Now it's your turn. Grab your brushes, ditch those fears, and just have fun with it.
Remember, every brushstroke, that's just a step in your own unique artistic adventure. Who knows what masterpieces you'll create?
And hey, if you discover any cool techniques, maybe ones that were inspired by a happy accident, be sure to let us know. Happy painting, everyone!